In the year 1720, the entire city of London seemed to lose its mind at once. Servants and dukes, poets and politicians, clergymen and shopkeepers, soldiers and widows, all of them crowded into the narrow streets and coffee houses around the Exchange, clutching handfuls of money, jostling and shouting, desperate to buy shares in a single company. A fever had gripped the capital, a fever for easy riches, and it burned hotter with every passing week. And within a matter of months, a great many of those same people would be utterly ruined, their fortunes gone, their names disgraced, some of them driven to despair, and worse. This is the story of the South Sea Bubble, the first great financial mania of the modern age, and the template, the original pattern, for very nearly every bubble and crash that has followed it in the 3 centuries since. It is a story of greed and delusion, of clever men and foolish schemes, of a whole society persuading itself to believe in something that was not there. And at its very center stands one of the most brilliant minds in all of human history, Sir Isaac Newton himself, who understood the laws that govern the stars and the planets, and yet was ruined all the same. Because the South Sea Bubble teaches a lesson that intelligence alone can never protect you from, and it is a lesson the world seems doomed to relearn, at terrible cost in every single generation. To understand the madness, you must first understand the scheme at the heart of it, because the South Sea Bubble was not born from nothing. It grew out of a very real and very serious problem. The British government, after years of costly wars, was staggering under an enormous burden of national debt. It owed vast sums to a great many people, and the weight of that debt hung over the nation's finances like a storm cloud. The government was desperate for a clever solution, some financial magic that might make the problem more manageable. And into that desperation stepped a company with a bold and beguiling proposal. The company was called the South Sea Company. On paper, its purpose was trade. It had been granted a monopoly, an exclusive right to conduct British trade with the ports of South America and the surrounding seas. To the public, this sounded like a license to print money. South America, in the imagination of the age, was a land of unimaginable wealth, of mountains of silver and rivers of gold, of endless riches, simply waiting to be carried home in the holds of British ships. Surely a company with the exclusive right to trade with such a place would grow fabulously rich, and everyone who owned a piece of it would grow rich alongside it. But here is the first and most important truth of the entire affair: that trade barely existed. Spain, which actually controlled most of South America, permitted the British only the smallest and most restricted access. A mere trickle of commerce that earned the company almost nothing of real value. The glittering vision of South American riches was, in cold reality, very nearly empty. The South Sea Company's true business was never really about trade at all. Its true business was something far cleverer and far more dangerous. It was about that national debt. The scheme, stripped of its complexity, worked like this. The South Sea Company proposed to take over a huge portion of the government's debt. The people to whom the government owed money would exchange what they were owed for shares in the company instead. In return for taking this weight off the government's shoulders, the company was granted the right to issue those shares. And the whole grand structure depended utterly and completely on one single thing: the price of the company's shares. If that price could be driven higher and higher, Everyone involved stood to profit enormously. The directors, the government, the early investors, all of them. And so the men who ran the South Sea Company set out, quite deliberately, to drive that price to the heavens. What followed was a masterclass in the art of inflating a bubble, and the methods they used are precisely the same methods used in every mania since. The directors of the company set about spreading rumors, glowing and irresistible rumors, of the fabulous wealth pouring in from the South Seas. Tales of treasure, of profitable voyages, of riches beyond counting were whispered in the coffee houses and printed in the papers. Confidence swelled. And as the story spread, people began, cautiously at first, and then in a flood, to buy the shares. And now the machine truly began to turn, because a bubble is a machine, an engine designed to inflate itself. As more people bought the shares, the price of those shares rose, and as the price rose, something dangerous happened in the minds of everyone watching. The rising price itself seemed to be the proof. Look, they said, the price is climbing, which means the rumors must be true, which means I should buy before it climbs higher still. And so the rising price drew in more buyers, and the new buyers pushed the price higher, which drew in still more buyers. Each rise appeared to justify the next. The evidence for the investment was simply the fact that its price was going up, a piece of circular logic that has bankrupted more people across history than almost any other single idea. The company poured fuel onto the fire in every way it could. Most dangerously of all, it began to lend people money to buy its own shares. Think about what that means. If you did not have the cash to join the frenzy, the company itself would lend it to you, so that you could buy its shares, which pushed the price up, which made everyone feel richer, which encouraged still more borrowing and buying. It was a perfect, self-reinforcing spiral, and for a while it seemed almost miraculous. Everyone was getting rich, and no one stopped to ask the simple, deadly question: rich from what? From what actual trade, what actual product, what actual profit? The answer, had anyone dared to look, was almost nothing at all. But nobody wanted to look. Looking was for cowards, for cynics, for those too timid to seize the fortune of a lifetime. The numbers of the mania are genuinely staggering even now. At the start of the year 1720, a single share in the South Sea Company traded at around £128. As the fever took hold through the spring and into the summer, the price began to climb with astonishing speed. £200, 300, 500. And then, at the very height of the madness, a single share reached a price of over £1,000. In the space of a few short months, the value of the shares had multiplied nearly eightfold. And let us be perfectly clear about why. Not because the company had discovered a single new source of wealth, not because it had sold anything, or traded anything, or earned anything of substance. The price had risen eightfold purely and entirely because everyone believed it would keep rising. It was belief, and nothing but belief, holding up a mountain of money. The mania did not stay confined to the South Sea Company alone. That is another mark of a true bubble, the way the madness spreads outward and infects everything around it. As Londoners watched ordinary people transformed into paper fortunes overnight, a wild enthusiasm for buying shares in almost anything took hold. And so, seeing the appetite of the crowd, promoters and swindlers rushed to launch dozens of brand new companies, each hoping to catch the same golden fever. These came to be known as the bubble companies, and some of them were so absurd that they would be comical if the consequences had not been so tragic. There were companies formed to import walnut trees, to make a wheel of perpetual motion, to insure and improve children's fortunes, to trade in human hair. And then there is the one that has echoed down the centuries as the perfect symbol of the whole insane episode. A company, so the famous account goes, was floated for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. A business, in other words, whose actual purpose the founder refused to reveal, and still, intoxicated by the certainty that any share would rise, that the only mistake was to hesitate, investors are said to have handed over their money for a stake in a mystery, in nothing at all. Whether every detail of that particular tale is literally true almost does not matter, because it captures something that was profoundly and dangerously real. A crowd so consumed by greed and by the fear of missing out that it had entirely stopped caring what it was actually buying. The physical heart of this frenzy was a narrow lane in the City of London called Exchange Alley, a cramped tangle of coffee houses and dealing rooms where the shares changed hands. And in the summer of 1720, it became the most feverish place in the entire kingdom. From dawn until long after dark, the alley was choked with a heaving, shouting mass of humanity, all pressed together in the pursuit of paper riches. Fine ladies arrived in their carriages and sat waiting while their agents fought through the crush to buy on their behalf. Aristocrats rubbed shoulders with tradesmen, clergymen with card sharps, all of them united by the single overpowering hope of getting rich before the miracle ended. Servants who had bought a few shares found themselves on paper wealthier than their masters. Fortunes were made and lost between breakfast and supper. It was said that a man could buy a share in the morning and sell it in the afternoon for double what he had paid, and for a giddy few months this was very nearly true. The whole ordinary business of the country seemed to pause, as if the nation had collectively decided that the tedious work of farming and manufacturing and trading was for fools, when a fortune could be conjured out of thin air in a coffee house in Exchange Alley. It was the atmosphere of a great carnival or a vast gambling hall, and almost nobody paused to consider that carnivals end, and that the house, in the end, always wins. And it is here, into this whirlwind of delusion, that our most famous character enters the story. For among the great crowd of investors caught up in the South Sea fever was none other than Sir Isaac Newton, the president of the Royal Society, the man who had unlocked the mathematics of gravity, who had explained the motion of the moon and the planets and the tides, whose mind was perhaps the most powerful the world had yet produced. And even he, this titan of human reason, was not immune. Newton, in fact, had played the game rather well at first. He had bought South Sea shares early when the price was still climbing, and at a certain point, showing admirable good sense, he sold them, walking away with a very handsome profit of thousands of pounds. He had, it seemed, been wise. He had taken his gains and stepped back from the table while the game was still on. Had the story ended there, Newton would be remembered as one of the few who kept his head. But the story did not end there, and this is the part that makes it immortal. Because Newton then had to watch, from the sidelines, as the price of the shares he had sold climbed higher and higher and higher still. He had to watch as friends and acquaintances, men perhaps not half so clever as he, grew richer and richer on the very shares he had abandoned. And something broke in him, the same something that breaks in all of us, that ancient and unbearable feeling of watching others grow wealthy while you stand aside. It has a name in our own time. We call it the fear of missing out. And it seized Isaac Newton, the greatest rational mind of his age, and it overwhelmed his judgment completely. So he bought back in. Near the top of the market, at a wildly inflated price, he plunged back into the South Sea shares, and this time with a far, far greater sum of his fortune than before. He abandoned the caution that had served him so well, and he joined the herd at the very worst possible moment. And then, of course, the inevitable happened. The bubble burst, and Isaac Newton lost a fortune, a sum that would be enormous even by the standards of today. The man who could measure the heavens had been ruined by the madness of the crowd, and he is said to have remarked, in the bitter aftermath, that he could calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. It is one of the great sentences in the history of money, precisely because of who spoke it. Because the crash did come, as it always must. A bubble inflated purely by belief requires one thing above all else to keep rising. It requires a constant, endless supply of new buyers, each one willing to pay more than the last. And at some point, that supply must run dry. The most eager buyers have already bought. The pool of people willing to pay these absurd prices begins, at last, to empty. And then the first whispers of doubt appear. A few of the largest and shrewdest holders, sensing that the peak has passed, quietly begin to sell, to lock in their gains while there are still fools to buy from. The price wavers, it stumbles, and the very same machine that had driven the price up now throws itself violently into reverse. For just as every rise had justified the next rise on the way up, now every fall justified the next fall on the way down. As the price dropped, holders panicked, and their panic made them sell, and their selling drove the price lower, which triggered more panic, which drove more selling. The spiral that had lifted the shares to the heavens now dragged them down towards the earth with terrifying speed. Through the autumn of 1720, the South Sea share price collapsed. The shares that had touched £1,000 tumbled back down toward 100 and below, wiping out almost everything the mania had created. Fortunes that had been built over a single glorious summer evaporated in a matter of weeks. And the human wreckage was appalling, because so many had borrowed to buy at the top, lured by the company's own eager lending. A great many people were left not merely poorer, but ruined, owing enormous sums on shares that were now worth a fraction of what they had paid. The ruin cut through every level of society, from the grandest aristocratic households to the humblest tradesmen who had staked their small savings on a dream. Suicides were reported. Families were destroyed. A wave of anguish and fury rolled across the country in the wake of the collapse. To grasp the true human weight of it, you have to remember who these people were. They were not, for the most part, seasoned speculators who understood the risks they ran. They were ordinary men and women who had been swept up in a national euphoria, who had been told by everyone and everything around them that this was a safe and certain path to a better life. There were clergymen who had invested the modest savings of a lifetime of service. There were widows who had staked the small inheritance that stood between them and destitution. There were families who had borrowed against their homes and their futures, certain they were securing prosperity for their children, only to find they had condemned them instead to years of debt and hardship. When the bubble burst, it did not simply erase numbers in a ledger. It shattered lives, dissolved marriages, drove proud men into hiding from their creditors, and filled the country with a bitterness and a sense of betrayal that lingered for a generation. The dream that had felt, only weeks before, like a gift from Providence, now revealed itself for what it had always been, a snare that had caught the trusting and the hopeful most cruelly of all. And perhaps the hardest truth of it was that so many of the ruined had done nothing that the wisest voices of their day had not encouraged. They had simply believed what they were told and followed the crowd and trusted that a thing rising so fast and so far must surely be real. The aftermath was as bitter as the mania had been intoxicating. There were furious demands for someone to be punished, and Parliament launched inquiries into the whole affair, and those inquiries uncovered exactly what you might by now expect: corruption on a grand scale. It emerged that the directors of the South Sea Company had bribed politicians and courtiers, handing out shares as gifts to buy their support and their silence. Ministers of the government were found to be deeply implicated. Some of the guilty fled the country to escape justice. Others had their estates seized to compensate, in some small part, the ruined public. A measure of retribution was extracted, but for the great mass of ordinary people who had been ruined, the money, quite simply, was gone, and it never came back. The deeper consequences of the disaster reached far beyond the punishment of a few guilty men. The South Sea bubble left a scar on the whole of British finance so deep that it did not fully heal for the better part of a century. In the immediate aftermath, a shaken and furious Parliament passed a law, remembered as the Bubble Act, which severely restricted the formation of the very kind of joint stock companies that had run wild in 1720. The instinct behind it was understandable, a desperate attempt to make sure such a mania could never happen again, but it also had a cost. For generations afterward, the raising of capital through public companies, one of the great engines of economic growth, was viewed across Britain with a deep and lingering suspicion. The word bubble itself entered the permanent vocabulary of finance, spoken ever after as a warning. A whole nation had been so badly burned that it flinched for lifetimes from the flame. There was a political dimension too, for the corruption uncovered by the inquiries reached into the very highest levels of the state, tainting the government and the court, and it fell to one particular politician to steer the country through the wreckage and restore some measure of confidence and stability. His skillful management of the crisis and its aftermath helped to establish him as the dominant figure in British political life, and he is often remembered as, in effect, the country's first Prime Minister. So even the shape of British government itself was influenced, in its way, by the fallout from the madness of 1720. A financial mania in a handful of London coffee houses had sent ripples outward that touched the law, the markets, and the highest offices of the land for generations to come. And that, perhaps, is the final measure of how large the South Sea bubble truly loomed. It was not merely a story of some investors losing money on a bad bet. It was a moment when an entire society lost its collective mind when the ordinary rules of caution and common sense were suspended across a whole nation, and when the reckoning that followed was so severe that it reshaped the country's laws, its finances, and even its politics for 100 years. It was, in every sense, the first modern financial catastrophe, and it set the pattern that all the others would follow. So what are we truly to take from this strange and distant episode 300 years on? The answer is that the South Sea bubble matters not because it is strange, but because it is so utterly, so chillingly familiar. Strip away the powdered wigs and the sailing ships and the coffee houses, and it is precisely the same story that has played out again and again in every generation since. A wonderful and mysterious new opportunity, a price that rises for no better reason than that it is already rising. The comforting proof found in every new high that the believers are wise and the doubters are fools. The frantic rush of ordinary people, terrified above all of being left behind, borrowing money to fling themselves in near the very top. And then, when the last new buyer has finally been found, the sudden and violent reversal as belief curdles into panic in the space of a few dreadful weeks. And Newton's lament endures for one reason above all. It tells us that the madness of a financial mania is not, at its root, a failure of intelligence. Some of the cleverest people who have ever lived have been ruined by bubbles, and Newton is only the most famous among them. It is not a failure of the mind. It is a failure of temperament, of character, of nerve. It is the near impossible task of remaining calm and rational while everyone around you appears to be growing effortlessly rich, and of holding firmly in your mind the one truth that the crowd has forgotten. That a price which has floated free of any real underlying value is not a fortune waiting patiently to be claimed. It is a trap, primed and set, waiting only for the moment to spring. And if you doubt that the lesson still applies, that we, in our modern and sophisticated age, have somehow grown too clever for such follies, then simply look at the centuries that followed. The same story has repeated itself in new costumes again and again and again. At the very end of the 20th century came the dot-com bubble, when the shares of internet companies, many of which had never earned a single penny of profit and never would, were bid up to insane and dizzying heights, purely on the promise of a glorious digital future, before collapsing and wiping out trillions of dollars of wealth. It was Exchange Alley all over again, only now the coffee houses were computer screens. In 2008 came the great housing and banking crisis, built once more on the comfortable and universal belief that a certain kind of asset, this time houses and the debts attached to them, could only ever rise in value, until it could not, and the whole world economy very nearly came down with it. And in our own time we have watched the wild manias in cryptocurrencies and in all manner of digital tokens, some of which have soared thousands of percent and then vanished into nothing, driven by exactly the same forces, the rumors, the fear of missing out, the price rising simply because it is rising, the crowd of ordinary people rushing in near the top. The technology changes, the particular dream changes. But the human beings never do. The same greed, the same hope, the same terror of being left behind while others grow rich, the same fatal willingness to believe, all of it is exactly as it was in the coffee houses of London 300 years ago. Isaac Newton's ghost haunts every trading floor and every phone screen to this day, whispering the same warning that so few ever heed. The South Sea Company itself survived in a diminished and chastened form for many decades after its great catastrophe, but its name passed permanently into the language as a byword for delusion, for folly, for the terrible moment when an entire society agrees, all together, to believe in something that simply is not real. And its deepest lesson was written in the end, not in the ledgers of the company, but in the ruined lives of the men and women who trusted it. When the only reason a thing is rising is that it is rising, the fall is already on its way. It is always only a question of when. Sources for this account include contemporary records of the South Sea Company crisis of 1720, the parliamentary inquiries that followed its collapse, the widely documented accounts of Sir Isaac Newton's involvement and losses, and the financial histories that have preserved the story of the mania and its ruin across the centuries.